Caleb Archer stood at the entrance of the Glacier Institute, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared up at the towering gates that loomed before him. The air was thick with the smell of alien technology and the faint hum of distant machinery. In every direction, cadets in combat gear marched with purpose, their eyes cold and unyielding. Caleb could feel their gazes, the judgment in their stares piercing through him. He wasn't supposed to be here. The academy was the most brutal military training ground in the galaxy, and he was human, just a regular human from a peaceful colony out on the edge of the galaxy, barely a blip on anyone's radar. And yet here he was standing on the precipice of his destiny or his downfall. As he took his first step into the compound, a sharp voice cut through the air. An instructor clad in silver armor, with a face as impassive as stone, turned toward him. Caleb barely managed to catch a glimpse of her. Before she was gone, she didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone spoke volumes. He was an outsider in a world of predators. The training began immediately, with no ceremony, no formalities, just harsh reality. They didn't care about his past or where he came from. The first trial was a basic combat simulation, but it was anything but basic for Caleb. The others, cadets from all corners of the galaxy, were formidable. Each one had years of training behind them. Some were genetically enhanced warriors from the Xerath, others were psionics capable of bending minds and emotions to their will. And then there were the Zealot who could manipulate time itself. Caleb was outclassed in every way. But Caleb was determined to survive, to prove that he belonged here. So he pushed himself harder than he ever had before. He fought through the pain as laser blasts whizzed past him, and enemy cadets outmaneuvered him at every turn. But he adapted quickly, like water flowing through cracks. Caleb realized that his strength didn't lie in brute force or enhanced abilities. It was his ability to think, his capacity to outsmart his opponents, that gave him an edge. In the first real skirmish, he found himself facing off against a Drakkar cadet who towered over him, at least 2 heads taller, with muscles like boulders. Caleb's instincts kicked in as the Drakkar lunged at him. He dodged narrowly, avoiding the massive fists that swung with deadly intent. Caleb scrambled to his feet, using the terrain to his advantage. He noticed a nearby set of barrels, lined with plasma mines. Without thinking, he ducked and rolled under the Drakkar's swipe, dragging him down with him into the cluster of mines. The explosion was deafening, but it worked. The Drakkar was momentarily stunned long enough for Caleb to disarm him, using his own size against him. Caleb didn't win the fight, but he did survive, and in this hellish place, survival was everything. The instructors watched closely, no doubt impressed, but Caleb saw something else in their eyes. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the beginning of recognition. He wasn't just a human anymore. He was a challenge, something they would have to reckon with, and that thought alone sent a shiver down his spine. Caleb knew that the real fight was only just beginning. The days blurred together as Caleb endured the brutal regimen of the Glacier Institute. Each morning began with physical trials that tested his limits, and every night ended with the exhaustion of having pushed himself beyond what he thought possible. The cadets around him moved with fluid precision, honed from years of training. They were natural warriors of terrifying skill. Caleb wasn't sure how long he could keep up. He was human, and it showed in every bruise and scrape that marred his body. But despite the relentless pain, something inside him refused to let go. There was a fire within him, a fierce desire to prove himself that burned brighter with every challenge. The first few weeks were the hardest. Caleb spent his nights pacing the cold stone floors of his quarters, trying to recover while he could, but even sleep didn't offer much relief. It felt like every day brought a new trial designed to break him physically or mentally. His body screamed for rest, but the tests never stopped. One morning, the cadets were awakened at dawn and forced into a series of grueling hand-to-hand combat drills. The instructor, a tall alien with thick black scales and piercing yellow eyes, pointed to Caleb. "You will fight Corin today, Archer," he said, his voice like gravel. Caleb glanced over at Corin the Drakkar, who had already begun cracking his knuckles with a sinister smile. It was clear the massive warrior had been waiting for this moment. Corin towered over Caleb like a mountain. He was a symbol of strength, pure and unrelenting. Caleb's stomach twisted, but he steeled himself. This was his chance to prove that he belonged. The fight began without warning. Corrin charged first, his fists like battering rams. Caleb barely had time to dodge before the first blow slammed into the ground, leaving a crater. Caleb's heart raced, but he kept his focus. His mind was his weapon, not his fists. He ducked low and rolled to the side, avoiding Corrin's next attack, which sent the ground beneath them shaking. Caleb came to his feet and scrambled to gain ground, but Corrin was relentless. Every punch sent shockwaves through the air. He was fast, but Caleb was faster. Caleb knew that in a contest of strength he had no chance, but in a game of wits he could win. He spotted the nearby sparring tools scattered across the training grounds and rushed for them. His hands closed around a short but sturdy rod just in time to parry a crushing blow from Corrin. Caleb had to fight smarter, not harder. He used the rod to keep Corrin at bay, deflecting each strike with precision, but never trying to overpower the beast of a cadet. His movements were quick, fluid as he watched for an opening. His opportunity came when Corrin swung a wild right hook. Caleb stepped in close and drove the rod into Corrin's stomach with every ounce of strength he had. The Drakkar grunted in pain, staggering backward. Caleb didn't hesitate. He twisted the rod and kicked Corrin's feet out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The arena fell silent for a moment as Caleb stood over Corrin, panting hard, both of them covered in sweat. Caleb's mind raced, but his eyes never left Corrin. His opponent slowly pushed himself up to his knees and glared at Caleb with burning hatred. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. This fight wasn't over, but Caleb had won the moment. He had proven himself to the cadets who watched from the sidelines and to the instructors who'd been observing from the shadows. The instructor stepped forward, nodding slowly in approval. He didn't say anything, just turned and walked away. Caleb stood still for a long moment, still catching his breath. The others had underestimated him, but now they couldn't ignore him. He was starting to carve out his place in this hellish place, and nothing would stop him from climbing higher. The days after Caleb's victory over Corrin were a blur of training exercises and brutal drills. The cadets who had once looked at him with scorn now watched him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Caleb knew they still saw him as weak, an outsider, but there was a shift in the air, a subtle acknowledgement that he had more to offer than they had originally thought. The instructors, too, seemed to take a closer interest in him, though they offered little praise or encouragement. They were ruthless and indifferent to his struggle, but their eyes followed his every move as if waiting for him to slip up. Caleb's body was bruised and battered from the constant strain, but he pushed through each day. He fought harder, learning to read his opponents and anticipating their moves. His human limitations were still very real, but with every sparring session, he grew sharper, quicker, more strategic. Caleb began to realize that he wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for respect for his place in this cutthroat world. The next major trial came without warning. It was a surprise drill meant to simulate a galactic combat operation, where cadets were pitted against one another in an environment designed to test their tactical skills. It was every cadet for themselves, a mock war, where alliances were temporary, and only the strongest survived. Caleb had seen it before during his brief time at the academy. The cadets who thrived in this world were the ones who could outsmart their enemies while fighting tooth and nail for every advantage. The stakes were higher now, and the tension was palpable. In the early hours of the drill, Caleb was paired with Tylara, the zealot cadet. He'd noticed before she was a strategist, calculating and precise. Her species had an unparalleled ability to manipulate time in short bursts, and it gave her an edge that most cadets couldn't match. Caleb had initially assumed she would ignore him, but to his surprise she spoke to him after their first briefing. "You may not be as strong as the others, but you have a sharp mind, Archer," she said, her tone cold but not unkind. "If you follow my lead, we might make it through this." Caleb hesitated. He didn't trust many of the other cadets, but Tylara's words held weight. She had proven herself a master tactician in the past, and he had seen her handle herself with an almost eerie calmness. He nodded wordlessly, and they formed an alliance, a temporary one, but one that could give them a fighting chance. The drill was brutal from the first moments they were dropped into the war zone. Caleb realized how much he had underestimated the severity of the situation. The terrain was treacherous. The cadets' relentless Tylara guided them through the early stages of the operation, dodging ambushes and setting traps for the other teams. Caleb followed her lead, watching her every move, absorbing her strategies. But as the day wore on, he realized that survival in this environment was more than just tactical thinking. It was about adaptability. Caleb had to take more risks. He began to rely on his intuition, his ability to read the battlefield and react to shifting circumstances. It wasn't long before their small team was ambushed by a larger group of cadets, led by Sethar, the Xerath warrior, who had made it clear from the beginning that he considered Caleb nothing more than an obstacle. Caleb's heart raced, but he refused to back down. He knew that fighting Sethar head-on would be suicide, but his mind raced through possible solutions and strategies. He took a deep breath and turned to Tylara. "We need to use the terrain against them," he said. "I'll create a diversion. You hit them from the flank." Tylara nodded without hesitation. Caleb set his plan into motion. He drew Sethar and his team into a narrow pass, using noise and movement to lure them in. As Sethar's squad advanced, Caleb triggered a series of traps hidden in the rocks, and brushed the sound of explosions, filled the air, sending the ambushers into chaos. Tylara moved swiftly, her time manipulation abilities slowing down their enemies just enough for her to strike. Caleb could see the fear in Sethar's eyes as the tables turned and his squad was thrown into disarray. When the dust cleared, Caleb and Tylara stood victorious. Sethar's squad had been incapacitated and forced to retreat. The alliance between Caleb and Tylara had worked, but Caleb knew that this victory wouldn't last long. He had made an enemy of Sethar, a powerful one, but for now they had earned their place. As Caleb caught his breath, he realized something important. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming a force to be reckoned with in this merciless place, and the galaxy would soon learn that underestimating him had been a mistake. The victory over Sethar's squad brought a fleeting sense of satisfaction, but Caleb knew better than to get comfortable. The Glacier Institute was a place where triumphs quickly turned into challenges, and every success only made him a bigger target. The other cadets, especially Sethar, would be looking for ways to take him down. But Caleb wasn't the same young man who had walked through the academy's gates weeks ago. He had proven his worth, earned a sliver of respect, and for the first time, he felt like he was more than just a pawn in this brutal game. As the days passed, the intensity of the training escalated. Caleb found himself thrust into even more complex and dangerous scenarios, each one designed to break his spirit. They were no longer just about survival. They were about leadership, strategy, and proving that you could outlast and outthink everyone around you. Caleb found himself in yet another battle scenario, but this time the stakes were different. The entire academy had been divided into squads for the interspecies strategy war games, an event designed to test the tactical genius of each cadet. The cadets were to execute a series of high-risk missions across a simulated war zone on a remote planet. The environment was unforgiving, and the goal was to capture a critical communications center while defending their base from constant enemy incursions. Caleb's squad was an eclectic mix of personalities and abilities, but they were united by necessity. Tylara, who had become his ally over the past weeks, was assigned to his squad again, and with her time manipulation skills, she would be their greatest asset. Venka, a cadet with dangerous psychic abilities, was also assigned, though her volatile powers were as unpredictable as the storm. Finally, there was Rin, a stealth expert from the Farthi species, known for their ability to move undetected across hostile terrain. Caleb quickly realized that to win, they would have to combine their skills into one seamless strategy. The game began with a loud, ear-splitting siren, signaling the start of the operation. From the very first moments, Caleb could sense the sheer intensity of the war zone. It was a cacophony of fire, explosions, and chaos. The ground shook as distant gunfire echoed across the barren landscape. Caleb had no illusions about what was at stake. This wasn't just a game. It was a test of their survival, and the instructors were watching closely. Caleb immediately took command, barking out orders with surprising confidence. Kalara's calm demeanor made her an excellent strategist, and she worked closely with Caleb, advising him on how to maximize their squad's abilities. Rin's stealth tactics allowed them to move through enemy lines unnoticed, while Venka's psychic abilities provided a shield against the enemy's ambushes. As the squad advanced, Caleb made sure to keep them together, constantly adjusting their movements as new intel came through. Every decision had to be made on the fly, and every move could be their last. The enemy squad, led by a ruthless Sarek, an alien known for his ability to read minds, was relentlessly pursuing them, and their trap was closing in. But Caleb saw an opening. He sent Venka ahead to infiltrate their base, while the rest of the squad laid a series of decoy traps to draw the enemy's attention. It was a risky plan, one that could easily go wrong, but Caleb had learned not to hesitate. In war, hesitation was as deadly as a bullet. As Venka moved through enemy lines, Caleb's heart pounded. The pressure was immense. One wrong move, and their entire squad would be exposed. But then, Venka made contact. The mission was a success. The enemy's focus shifted, and Caleb seized the opportunity. In a synchronized strike, the squad stormed the communications center, using their unique skills to incapacitate Sarek's squad and secure the critical objective. The aftermath of the battle was chaos, but Caleb couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. They had done it. They had outsmarted an enemy far more experienced and ruthless. But Caleb knew that this victory was only temporary. He had earned the respect of his squad, and more importantly, he had earned their trust. But with every success, the stakes got higher, and Sether's hatred for him grew stronger. Caleb wasn't just surviving anymore. He was becoming a force to be reckoned with, and that terrified the very people who thought they were invincible. The real test was still ahead, and Caleb could feel it in his bones. The war games were just the beginning. The victory over Sarek's squad gave Caleb and his team a brief moment of respite, but the Glacier Institute's instructors wasted no time in moving to the next phase of training. Caleb could feel the weight of their expectations bearing down on him, and he knew that any moment of weakness would be seized upon. The peace was fleeting. It was always fleeting here. In the days that followed, Caleb's squad became more cohesive. They were a well-oiled machine, each member playing to their strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. But even within this fragile unity, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Venka, the psychic cadet, was still a wild card. Her powers were immense, but her control over them was often erratic. On occasion, she'd accidentally unleash a burst of energy, throwing the squad into chaos. Rin, the stealth expert, was more reserved and seemed to resent being tied to a group effort, preferring to work alone. Yet, despite their differences, Caleb knew that without each of them, they would never make it through the next stage of the trials. The next test was announced in a cold, indifferent tone by the Academy's commanding officer, Admiral Xiruk, a towering alien from the Kargrath species. His species was known for its brutal martial prowess and unwavering discipline, and he was a constant presence in the Academy's harsh environment. "This will be your most difficult trial yet," Admiral Xiruk's voice echoed over the loudspeakers. "You will be placed in a hostile environment and expected to complete a series of objectives while dealing with constant threats. Your squad will be divided into 2 teams. One will secure the primary objective, while the other will act as a diversion. Failure will result in immediate expulsion from the Academy." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. This wasn't just about winning. This was about survival. The stakes had never been higher. As Caleb prepared for the trial, he couldn't shake the sense of dread settling in his gut. They were going into a simulated combat zone, one that had been designed specifically to push cadets to their absolute limits. The environment would be harsh, and the clock would be ticking. His mind raced as he calculated every possible outcome, every possible move. This was no longer just about survival. It was about mastering the battlefield, controlling the chaos before it consumed them all. When the exercise began, Caleb's team was thrust into the simulation without warning. The environment was harsh, barren, rocky terrain with little cover, just a bleak, desolate landscape stretching for miles. The enemy force, a team of cadets handpicked by the instructors, was positioned miles away. But Caleb knew that they wouldn't have the luxury of waiting. The enemy would be relentless. Their first objective was clear: secure a high-value intel station located deep within the enemy's territory. But getting there was no easy feat. Caleb's squad had to navigate through an alien forest of jagged cliffs, rivers that ran red with some unknown chemical, and volatile, shifting sandstorms that tore at their skin. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against them. Tylara's time manipulation abilities proved invaluable as they made their way through the deadly terrain. Her powers slowed time for critical moments, allowing Caleb and the rest of the squad to navigate dangerous obstacles and take out hostile scouts. Rin, as always, moved like a shadow, disappearing into the landscape to gather intelligence or sabotage the enemy's communications. And Venka, though volatile, used her psychic powers to manipulate the enemy's perceptions, sending them into confusion just long enough to give them the advantage. But even with these advantages, it wasn't enough. The enemy squad was everywhere, anticipating their every move. Caleb realized that they were up against more than just other cadets. They were up against their instructors, who were directing the simulation from hidden vantage points. The moment Caleb's squad breached the perimeter of the enemy camp, an ambush was sprung. A dozen cadets, including Sether, emerged from the shadows, weapons raised, eyes cold and focused. They had been waiting for Caleb's team to make a mistake, and now they had them cornered. Caleb's heart raced as he assessed the situation. His team was trapped, surrounded on all sides. It felt like the walls were closing in, and every instinct screamed at him to retreat. But retreat wasn't an option, not here. He couldn't afford to lose, not when everything was on the line. Without hesitation, Caleb made a split-second decision. He would sacrifice himself to give his team the chance they needed. He called out to Tylara, signaling for her to move with Rin and Venka toward the intel station, while he distracted the enemy. Sether's eyes burned with fury as he stepped forward, eager to finally eliminate the human who had been a thorn in his side. Caleb stood his ground, ready to face whatever came next. The battle for survival was just beginning. The victory over Sarak's squad gave Caleb and his team a brief moment of respite, but the Glacier Institute's instructors wasted no time in moving to the next phase of training. Caleb could feel the weight of their expectations bearing down on him, and he knew that any moment of weakness would be seized upon. The peace was fleeting. It was always fleeting here. In the days that followed, Caleb's squad became more cohesive. They were a well-oiled machine, each member playing to their strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. But even within this fragile unity, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Venka, the psychic cadet, was still a wild card. Her powers were immense, but her control over them was often erratic. On occasion, she'd accidentally unleash a burst of energy, throwing the squad into chaos. Rin, the stealth expert, was more reserved and seemed to resent being tied to a group effort, preferring to work alone. Yet, despite their differences, Caleb knew that without each of them, they would never make it through the next stage of the trials. The next test was announced in a cold, indifferent tone by the Academy's commanding officer, Admiral Xirak, a towering alien from the Kargrath species. His species was known for its brutal martial prowess and unwavering discipline, and he was a constant presence in the Academy's harsh environment. "This will be your most difficult trial yet," Admiral Xirak's voice echoed over the loudspeakers. "You will be placed in a hostile environment and expected to complete a series of objectives while dealing with constant threats. Your squad will be divided into 2 teams. One will secure the primary objective, while the other will act as a diversion. Failure will result in immediate expulsion from the Academy. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. This wasn't just about winning. This was about survival. The stakes had never been higher. As Caleb prepared for the trial, he couldn't shake the sense of dread settling in his gut. They were going into a simulated combat zone, one that had been designed specifically to push cadets to their absolute limits. The environment would be harsh, and the clock would be ticking. His mind raced as he calculated every possible outcome, every possible move. This was no longer just about survival. It was about mastering the battlefield, controlling the chaos before it consumed them all. When the exercise began, Caleb's team was thrust into the simulation without warning. The environment was harsh, barren, rocky terrain with little cover, just a bleak, desolate landscape stretching for miles. The enemy force, a team of cadets handpicked by the instructors, was positioned miles away. But Caleb knew that they wouldn't have the luxury of waiting. The enemy would be relentless. Their first objective was clear: secure a high-value intel station located deep within the enemy's territory. But getting there was no easy feat. Caleb's squad had to navigate through an alien forest of jagged cliffs, rivers that ran red with some unknown chemical, and volatile, shifting sandstorms that tore at their skin. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against them. Tylara's time manipulation abilities proved invaluable as they made their way through the deadly terrain. Her powers slowed time for critical moments, allowing Caleb and the rest of the squad to navigate dangerous obstacles and take out hostile scouts. Rin, as always, moved like a shadow, disappearing into the landscape to gather intelligence or sabotage the enemy's communications. And Venka, though volatile, used her psychic powers to manipulate the enemy's perceptions, sending them into confusion just long enough to give them the advantage. But even with these advantages, it wasn't enough. The enemy squad was everywhere, anticipating their every move. Caleb realized that they were up against more than just other cadets. They were up against their instructors, who were directing the simulation from hidden vantage points. The moment Caleb's squad breached the perimeter of the enemy camp, an ambush was sprung. A dozen cadets, including Sether, emerged from the shadows, weapons raised, eyes cold and focused. They had been waiting for Caleb's team to make a mistake, and now they had them cornered. Caleb's heart raced as he assessed the situation. His team was trapped, surrounded on all sides. It felt like the walls were closing in, and every instinct screamed at him to retreat. But retreat wasn't an option. Not here. He couldn't afford to lose, not when everything was on the line. Without hesitation, Caleb made a split-second decision. He would sacrifice himself to give his team the chance they needed. He called out to Tylara, signaling for her to move with Rin and Venka toward the intel station, while he distracted the enemy. Sether's eyes burned with fury as he stepped forward, eager to finally eliminate the human who had been a thorn in his side. Caleb stood his ground, ready to face whatever came next. The battle for survival was just beginning. The battlefield was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the skirmish. Sether's body lay motionless, the faint glow of his blood staining the dirt beneath him. Caleb stood over him, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. He had survived another battle. Barely, but he wasn't sure if it was the victory that mattered. What haunted him was the truth that every victory in this brutal place came at a cost. The cadets around him, his squad, moved with tense urgency as they continued toward their objective. But Caleb's mind was far from the mission at hand. He had done what was necessary, but Sether's death felt hollow. It wasn't just the physical toll. It was the realization that this place, this academy, wasn't just breaking them down. It was shaping them into weapons. Weapons that would be used until they were no longer useful. And that thought gnawed at Caleb. A constant reminder that he was part of something much bigger than himself. Something that didn't care about him. Only what he could do. He pushed the thoughts aside. There was no room for weakness here. No room for doubt. Tylara, Rin, and Venka had made it to the intel station without further incident, and the station was now secured. The enemy squad, though disoriented and broken from the ambush, was still alive. They would regroup, undoubtedly, and Caleb had no illusions about what would happen if they caught up with his squad. They wouldn't show mercy, and neither would he. Caleb made his way to the others, his body aching with every step, but he focused on the mission. His squad had a critical advantage now, control of the intel station. But it wasn't enough to rest. The enemy would be closing in soon, and they needed to be prepared. They set up defensive positions around the station, fortifying it as best they could with the limited resources at their disposal. "Venka, get in position," Caleb ordered, his voice firm despite the exhaustion weighing on him. "Tylara, Rin, you're with me. We're not waiting for them to come to us." They nodded without hesitation. Caleb had earned their trust, and that was all he needed to keep them moving forward. They were a team now, forged in the fires of conflict. Caleb's eyes scanned the horizon, every muscle tensed for the next move. He could feel the pressure building again. The game wasn't over. The enemy would come for them. They would come for him. Suddenly, the distant rumble of engines filled the air. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. It was the enemy, reinforcements, no doubt. The intel station had already been detected. The enemy was regrouping, and they were bringing everything they had. "Get ready," Caleb barked. "They'll be here in minutes." Tylara's calm voice cut through the tension. "I'll slow them down. Give us some time." She raised her hand, and the air around her shimmered with energy. Caleb's eyes flicked toward her, watching the way she manipulated time, slowing the advancing enemy forces. Her abilities weren't perfect, but they gave them a crucial edge in moments like this. Rin was already on the move, positioning herself in the shadows, ready to strike from the cover of darkness. Venka, her psychic abilities charged and ready, stood by Caleb's side, her eyes glowing with concentrated focus. "Keep your heads down," Caleb muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He didn't know if they could survive what was coming, but he wasn't about to let them go down without a fight. He had learned too much and come too far to lose now. As the sound of engines grew louder, Caleb's breath quickened. The enemy was closing in. The final test was upon them. There would be no more retreat, no more running. This was where everything would either break apart or come together. The fate of his squad, and his place in this brutal institution, rested on what happened next. In the distance, a figure appeared on the horizon. Sethar's second in command, leading the charge. Caleb's grip tightened on his weapon. The true test had arrived, and he would face it, head-on, with everything he had left. "Brace yourselves," Caleb whispered, his voice steely. "This is it." The enemy forces appeared like a storm on the horizon, a dark tide of figures racing toward the intel station with a relentless drive. Caleb's squad had prepared the best they could, but this was different. The sound of the engines, the heavy boots of soldiers marching in perfect synchronization. It was all deafening. His mind raced as the final moments before the assault closed in. Tylara's time manipulation abilities were a temporary solution, a tool to buy them a few precious seconds, but Caleb knew they couldn't rely solely on that. His squad had to be ready for a full-on fight. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no fear. Not anymore. Fear was a luxury the Glacier Institute had stripped from him. It was replaced with something colder, something sharper, a purpose. "Venka, get ready to block their movements," Caleb instructed, his voice low but firm. Venka nodded, her brow furrowing as she concentrated. Her psychic powers weren't as refined as Tylara's time-bending abilities, but they were just as deadly. She could create mental barriers, disorient their enemies, and even crush the minds of weaker-willed cadets. But the enemy closing in wasn't weak. They would push against her defenses with everything they had. Rin, cloaked in her near invisibility, moved to a high-ground position, the shadows swallowing her form. Caleb knew she was already in position, ready to pick off enemies from the dark. Her sniper rifle set to neutralize any threats before they even knew where the attack had come from. "Stay sharp," Caleb murmured, tightening his grip on his weapon. "We're not running this time." The rumble of enemy vehicles grew louder, until a line of assault drones emerged from the dust, their sleek forms gleaming with deadly precision. Behind them, the enemy infantry came into view, cadets clad in battle armor, their eyes cold with determination. Sether's second-in-command, a hulking alien with 4 arms and a snarl that could strip paint, led them. Caleb had seen him in earlier trials. Krath was known for his brute force and brutal efficiency, a natural-born killer. They had no time to waste. "Now!" Caleb shouted, and in an instant, the air seemed to warp around them. Tylara accelerated time, sending the advancing enemy forces into a temporary slow motion. The slow pace only lasted for a few seconds, but it was enough. Venka immediately acted, extending her mental influence outward, cloaking their position and creating a haze of confusion in the minds of the oncoming cadets. Their movements became erratic, their confidence shaken. Several of the enemy stumbled, unsure of where they were. That split second was all Rin needed. From her elevated position, she unleashed a hail of suppressing fire. The first few rounds hit their targets, taking down key enemies before they even knew what hit them. "Hold them off," Caleb commanded. His heart beat like a drum in his chest, but his voice remained steady, like the calm in the eye of a storm. He was in his element, the chaos of battle fueling his every decision. As Krath's squad staggered under the fire, Caleb didn't waste the opportunity. He and Tylara rushed forward, dodging blasts from the assault drones and weaving between debris. Caleb's mind processed everything in rapid succession, each move instinctual. He targeted the drones, taking down one with a precise shot to its power core. Then he pivoted, using his environment to his advantage, ducking behind rocks and enemy equipment to stay one step ahead. Krath charged, his 4 arms swinging a massive energy mace with terrifying force. Caleb barely sidestepped the first strike, feeling the air crackle where the weapon passed. He countered with a shot to Krath's exposed side, but the alien's armor deflected it, and Krath howled in fury. The fight with Krath was brutal, hand-to-hand combat. No tricks, no shortcuts, just raw strength and speed. Krath's blows were powerful, but Caleb had learned to move with purpose, using the alien's own rage against him. They clashed, each strike a testament to their respective training. Caleb dodged and retaliated, hitting Krath in the joints where his armor was weakest. Finally, with a well-timed move, Caleb ducked under Krath's swing, sweeping the alien's legs out from under him. Krath's massive form crashed to the ground, temporarily stunned. Caleb seized the opportunity, flipping over the fallen alien and using his momentum to land a disabling strike to Krath's helmet, short-circuiting the control systems. Krath lay there, barely able to move. Caleb stood over him, breathing heavily. "Not today," he whispered, his voice low and cold. The rest of the enemy forces, stunned by their leader's defeat, began to retreat. But Caleb wasn't done. He signaled to his squad, and they took advantage of the disarray. The tide had turned. When the battle was over, the battlefield fell silent once again, save for the sound of Caleb's squad regrouping. They had held their ground, outsmarted their enemies, and emerged victorious, once again proving that no matter how harsh the odds, a human could carve his own path through the stars. Caleb looked over his squad. They were bruised, bloodied, but they were alive. And in the harshest military academy in the galaxy, that was enough. The war was far from over. But for now, Caleb had shown that he was no one's pawn. And that was only the beginning.